Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey into one of the defining conflicts of the modern age, the Gulf War of 1991. This is not just the story of tanks and missiles, of oil fields set ablaze and skies lit by fire, but of people, leaders torn by decisions, soldiers standing in deserts of uncertainty, and civilians caught in a storm beyond their control. Today, we revisit a moment when the world stood at the crossroads of fear and power. A time when a single invasion threatened to reshape the global order. Together we will walk through the sands of Kuwait, the command centers of Washington and Baghdad, and the burning oil fields that scarred the earth. This is more than history. It is a lesson in courage, tragedy, and resilience. By the end, you will not only understand what happened, but feel it. The weight of choices, the cries of the innocent, and the triumphs and costs of war will echo in every chapter. So prepare yourself, because the Gulf War was not just fought with bombs, it was written with the blood, sweat, and fears of millions. Imagine a night sky over the desert, silent for centuries, suddenly torn apart by the roar of jet engines, the thunder of missiles, and the world holding its breath as the largest coalition since World War II unleashed its fury. This is the Gulf War. Subscribe for more history. Like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth, this is history, and it begins here. The story of the Gulf War does not begin in 1990. It begins years earlier, forged in the fires of the Iran-Iraq War. For nearly a decade, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had poured its resources, its youth, and its strength into a bloody stalemate against its eastern neighbor. Cities were bombarded, borders were contested, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers fell, leaving behind a generation scarred by loss. Yet, as the dust of war settled in 1988, Iraq was not victorious, it was broken. The nation's coffers were empty. Its oil wealth had been mortgaged to finance the endless conflict. Billions of dollars in loans, especially from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, hung over Baghdad like a curse. Iraq's people, already battered, now lived under the weight of hunger, inflation, and despair. But Saddam Hussein saw something different. He looked at his war-torn nation and did not see defeat. He saw destiny. Iraq, he believed, had earned the right to lead the Arab world. He saw himself as a new Saladin, the legendary warrior of Mesopotamian soil, destined to carve a legacy that stretched from the Tigris to the Persian Gulf. The seeds of conflict grew here, in ambition, in desperation, and in the scars of war. Saddam demanded debt forgiveness from his Gulf neighbors, claiming Iraq had bled for them by holding back Iran's revolution, but Kuwait and Saudi Arabia refused. Worse still, Kuwait increased its oil production, lowering prices, and stripping Iraq of vital revenue. To Saddam, this was betrayal. To his people, it was slow suffocation. This was the moment when ambition and grievance intertwined. The Iraqi regime began whispering in speeches, in propaganda, in promises, Iraq would rise again. The soldiers who had survived the horrors of the 1980s were not returning to peace, but preparing for another confrontation. The people, weary of struggle, did not yet know that an even greater storm was gathering on the horizon. As night fell over Baghdad in the late 1980s, the city's lights flickered weakly, oil-fueled generators humming against the darkness. Behind the palace walls, Saddam and his inner circle plotted their next move. The seeds of the Gulf War were planted not by oil alone, nor by borders, but by pride, debt, and a man's determination to carve his name into history, even if it meant dragging his people into another abyss. The Iran-Iraq War, which raged from 1980 to 1988, left scars so deep that even decades later they remained unhealed. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, claiming nearly 1 million lives, wounding countless more, and leaving both nations in ruin. Iraq had entered the war with bravado, hoping to seize Iranian territory and establish itself as the leading Arab power. Instead, it found itself bogged down in years of trench warfare, chemical attacks, and human wave assaults that turned the desert into a graveyard. When the guns finally fell silent in 1988, the ceasefire brought no true peace. For Iraq, victory was hollow. No land had been gained, no great prize had been secured, but the costs were staggering. The nation was drowning in debt, nearly $80 billion, and much of its infrastructure lay in shambles. Schools, hospitals, and homes had been abandoned for the sake of war production. A generation of young men had been lost to the front lines, their families left in grief and poverty. Saddam Hussein, however, refused to see Iraq as defeated. He declared his country the defender of the Arab world, claiming Iraq had saved the Gulf states from Iran's revolutionary tide. But beneath the speeches, fear brewed. The army, though battle-hardened, was exhausted and restless. Returning soldiers whispered stories of futility. Civilians, once hopeful of glory, now faced rationing, inflation, and despair. In Baghdad, the government launched a campaign to glorify the war. Posters of soldiers raising flags, parades celebrating victory, and constant reminders of sacrifice. But the truth was harder to hide. Widows stood in endless lines for meager food rations. Children grew up without fathers. Villages along the Iran-Iraq border lay in rubble. It was in this fragile aftermath that Saddam's paranoia deepened. He trusted no one, purged officers he suspected of disloyalty, and surrounded himself with loyalists. He began looking outward, toward Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, for a way to restore Iraq's strength. If the Iran-Iraq war had taught him anything, it was that survival depended not on peace, but on power. And so, even as Iraq licked its wounds, Saddam's ambitions sharpened. The ceasefire was not an ending, it was the beginning of another storm. When the last artillery shells fell silent in 1988, Iraq found itself trapped in a new battlefield, one fought not with tanks and rifles, but with numbers and debt. The Iran-Iraq war had devoured Iraq's wealth. For 8 long years, Baghdad had borrowed heavily to fuel its war machine, receiving billions from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states. By war's end, Iraq owed nearly $80 billion, a staggering weight for a country already shattered. The economy crumbled. Oil, Iraq's lifeline, could no longer cover the mountain of debt. Infrastructure lay broken, factories idle, bridges destroyed, power plants in need of repair. Inflation soared, and the value of Iraqi dinars plummeted. Families once sustained by oil revenues now found themselves queuing for bread, their savings reduced to scraps of paper. Saddam Hussein, however, refused to see Iraq as a debtor nation. In fiery speeches, he framed Iraq as a hero of the Arab world, declaring that his country's sacrifices had protected Kuwait and Saudi Arabia from Iran's revolution. To him, Iraq deserved gratitude, not repayment. He demanded forgiveness of debts and more oil revenues. But the Gulf monarchies, nervous of Saddam's growing power, refused. Worse still, Kuwait increased its oil production beyond OPEC limits, driving prices down. Every barrel sold cheaper was a dagger in Iraq's economy. What Baghdad saw as betrayal, Kuwait saw as business. To Saddam, however, this was economic warfare. In smoky rooms of Baghdad's palaces, Saddam's advisors whispered of conspiracy. The narrative of victimhood took shape. Iraq had bled for the Arab world, and now the Arab world was repaying it with treachery. As poverty deepened in Iraqi streets, resentment hardened into rage. Soldiers returning from the Iran-Iraq war found no jobs, no support, only propaganda promising that Iraq's destiny was still great. The debt crisis was not merely a financial wound. It became the justification for something far more dangerous. With every unpaid bill, every drop in oil prices, and every refusal from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, Saddam's resolve grew. To restore Iraq's dignity and power, he would not turn inward to rebuild. He would turn outward, toward confrontation. The path to Kuwait was being paved not by armies but by debts, oil and pride. Oil was the lifeblood of Iraq. It paid for its armies, fed its people, and sustained Saddam Hussein's dream of becoming the leader of the Arab world. But in the late 1980s, oil became the source of Iraq's greatest frustration, and the stage on which the Gulf War began to take shape. After the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq desperately needed high oil prices to rebuild. Every barrel sold meant money to repair shattered cities, pay off crushing debts, and support its struggling citizens. But instead of rising, oil prices fell. The reason: overproduction by fellow OPEC members, especially Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates. In Saddam's eyes, this was no accident. He believed Kuwait was deliberately flooding the market, pushing oil prices down to weaken Iraq. Every dollar lost meant millions stripped from Baghdad's budget. The propaganda machine painted Kuwait not as a neighbor, but as an enemy stabbing Iraq in the back while its people starved. At OPEC meetings, Iraq thundered for restraint, demanding others cut production to raise prices. Saddam declared that Iraq's sacrifice during the Iran-Iraq war gave it the right to higher revenues. But Kuwait and the UAE refused. Their fields pumped day and night, filling global markets with cheap oil. The crisis deepened when Iraq accused Kuwait of something more sinister: slant drilling. Iraqi officials claimed Kuwait was siphoning oil directly from the Rumaila field that straddled their shared border. To Saddam, this was theft, an act of economic aggression. He warned that Iraq would not stand idle while its wealth was stolen. The anger in Baghdad boiled over. Newspapers screamed headlines of betrayal. On the streets, ordinary Iraqis, already enduring hunger and rationing, began to believe the narrative: Kuwait was the enemy. Soldiers grumbled that their sacrifice in the Iran-Iraq war had been for nothing, while their neighbors grew rich off Iraqi suffering. Saddam's speeches grew darker, more threatening. He compared Kuwait's actions to colonial theft, accusing it of conspiring with the West to strangle Iraq. The stage was being set, not for negotiation, but for confrontation. The oil fields of the Gulf were no longer just economic zones. They were battlegrounds, dripping with both crude and conflict. And in Saddam's mind, one conclusion was becoming clear: if diplomacy would not raise oil prices, then force would. By 1990, Iraq stood at a crossroads. The war with Iran had ended, but the nation was bleeding internally. Debt strangled its economy, oil prices collapsed, and public unrest simmered. For most leaders, this would have been a moment of humility and reconstruction. But Saddam Hussein was not like most leaders. Saddam saw himself as the defender of the Arab world, a man destined to dominate the Middle East. He was convinced that Iraq's survival and his legacy depended on bold action. In his palace, behind walls of marble and guarded by loyalists, he weighed his options. To continue begging Kuwait and Saudi Arabia for debt forgiveness was beneath him. To accept OPEC's low prices was to submit to humiliation. For Saddam, there was only one path forward: force. In meetings with his Revolutionary Command Council, Saddam laid out his grievances. Kuwait, he said, was conspiring with the West to weaken Iraq. Kuwait's oil overproduction was an act of economic warfare, and slant drilling into the Rumaila oil field was nothing less than theft of Iraqi wealth. His voice rose in fury as he declared, "We will not kneel to Kuwait. If they do not respect Iraq's rights, then we will take what is ours." His generals listened uneasily. Some urged caution, reminding Saddam of the United States, the world's dependence on Gulf oil, and the danger of another war. But Saddam silenced them with a glare. He believed the world would not intervene. America, he argued, had no stomach for another conflict so soon after Vietnam. The Arab states, divided and fearful, would not unite against Iraq, and the Soviet Union, weakened by its own collapse, could not act. In his mind, the calculation was simple: Iraq could invade Kuwait, seize its oil wealth, cancel its debts, and emerge as the dominant power in the region, all without serious resistance. Outside the palace, however, Iraq's people lived a different reality. Breadlines grew longer. Families pawned what little they had to survive. Soldiers returned home only to be told they might fight again. Yet the propaganda machine roared louder than ever, filling the airwaves with promises that Iraq's destiny was greatness. Saddam's calculations were not just about economics. They were about pride, survival, and fear of weakness. He could not allow Iraq to look broken, for weakness invited rebellion at home and disrespect abroad, and so, the dictator sharpened his plan. Kuwait was no longer a neighbor, it was a target. The seeds of war were no longer whispers, they were becoming a blueprint. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, the desert silence was shattered. At dawn, Iraqi tanks and armored divisions roared across the Kuwaiti border. Under the cover of darkness, Saddam Hussein's forces had prepared for weeks, and now the plan unfolded with ruthless precision. Columns of tanks rolled through the sand, engines growling like thunder. Helicopters swept overhead, their rotors slicing the air as paratroopers descended. The Kuwaiti border guards, outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared, fought desperately, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Within hours, Iraq's elite Republican Guard poured into Kuwait City. Civilians awoke to chaos. The ground shook beneath their homes. The sky filled with smoke, and gunfire echoed through the streets. Families huddled together, terrified, as soldiers stormed government buildings and raised the Iraqi flag. The invasion was swift and merciless. By the end of the day, Kuwait, an independent nation, was under Iraqi control. Saddam justified the attack with fiery propaganda, claiming Kuwait was stealing Iraq's wealth and conspiring with colonial powers. But the truth was far simpler. Iraq wanted Kuwait's oil and its strategic position on the Gulf. With it, Saddam believed Iraq would control the heartbeat of the world's energy supply. The international community watched in shock. Kuwait, a small but wealthy nation, had been swallowed in less than 24 hours. Footage of burning streets, fleeing civilians, and tanks rolling past skyscrapers filled TV screens worldwide. For Iraqis, Saddam declared victory. For Kuwaitis, it was the beginning of occupation. For the world, it was the spark of a storm that would change history. News of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait spread across the globe like wildfire. Within hours, world leaders, diplomats, and ordinary people watched in disbelief as one sovereign nation swallowed another. Television networks broadcast grainy footage of Iraqi tanks rolling through Kuwait City, and suddenly, the Middle East was at the center of the world's attention. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush convened his advisors. His words were clear: this aggression will not stand. Across the Atlantic, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher echoed the same determination. France, Germany, and other NATO allies condemned the invasion. For the United Nations, it was a crisis demanding immediate action. The Security Council moved swiftly, passing resolutions that denounced Iraq's aggression and demanded immediate withdrawal. Economic sanctions were imposed, freezing Iraqi assets and cutting vital trade. Saddam, however, remained defiant, appearing on Iraqi state television and vowing that Kuwait was now Iraq's 19th province. Meanwhile, the Arab world was divided. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Gulf states recoiled in fear. If Iraq could take Kuwait, who would be next? Yet other voices, wary of Western intervention, urged negotiation instead of war. On the streets of Kuwait, the shock was turning into terror. Families packed their belongings, fleeing south toward Saudi Arabia. Others hid in basements, fearful of Iraqi patrols. Resistance groups began to whisper of defiance, even as Iraqi tanks rumbled through the city. For ordinary Iraqis, the mood was mixed. Propaganda framed the invasion as a triumph, a victory for Arab pride against greedy neighbors. Some cheered Saddam's boldness. Others, weary from war, felt only dread, knowing the world's wrath would soon descend upon their country. The shockwaves of August 1990 were not just political, they were emotional. The invasion of Kuwait shattered the illusion of stability in the Gulf, ignited fear in global markets, and set the stage for one of the largest military coalitions in modern history. The storm was gathering. The invasion of Kuwait sent shockwaves not only through the Gulf, but across the globe. For Saudi Arabia, the fear was immediate and existential. Iraqi tanks were now only a few hundred miles from its border, and Saddam Hussein's ambitions seemed limitless. If Kuwait could fall in a single day, what would stop Iraq from seizing the oil fields of the kingdom itself? In Riyadh, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, faced a decision that would change history. Should he rely on Arab diplomacy, hoping Saddam would withdraw, or should he take the unprecedented step of inviting Western troops into the heart of the Islamic world? For days he weighed the risks. On one hand, Saddam's army was massive, battle-hardened, and ruthless. On the other, bringing foreign troops onto holy soil risked backlash from within. But the threat was too great. On August 7, 1990, the decision was made. Saudi Arabia would host American and coalition forces. Thus began Operation Desert Shield. The skies over the desert roared as U.S. transport planes landed one after another, unloading tanks, armored vehicles, and thousands of troops. Soldiers stepped out into the scorching Arabian sun, their faces determined but wary. Sand stretched endlessly before them, the looming shadow of Saddam's army to the north. President George H. W. Bush addressed the world, declaring that American forces were there to draw a line in the sand. That line was Saudi Arabia's border, and behind it stood the largest military buildup since World War II. Within weeks, tens of thousands of American troops were joined by soldiers from Britain, France, Egypt, and other nations. The coalition was forming, not yet to attack, but to defend. For ordinary Saudis, the sight was surreal. Foreign troops filled bases, convoys rumbled through towns, and the desert became a fortress. Some welcomed the protection, others murmured uneasily about outsiders on sacred land. But for the world, Operation Desert Shield sent a clear message: Saddam Hussein's aggression would not go unanswered. The Gulf had become the stage of history, and the sands of Arabia were now the front lines of a global confrontation. As Operation Desert Shield expanded, the United States understood that defending Saudi Arabia and eventually liberating Kuwait could not be a unilateral effort. To achieve legitimacy, it needed allies, and so, a coalition unlike anything seen since World War II began to take shape. At the United Nations, U.S. diplomats pushed for resolutions condemning Iraq's aggression. One after another, nations spoke in outrage at Saddam Hussein's defiance. Within weeks, the Security Council imposed sweeping sanctions, isolating Iraq economically. Yet more was needed. America reached out to its NATO allies, to Arab states, and even to nations that had once stood on opposite sides of the Cold War. Britain quickly committed troops under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's successor, John Major. France pledged its famed Foreign Legion. Egypt, led by Hosni Mubarak, offered divisions of its army. Syria, astonishingly, joined the coalition as well. President Hafez al-Assad, deciding that Saddam's ambitions threatened the region more than his rivalry with the West. Dozens of countries, from Canada to Senegal, sent forces, money, or logistical support. The coalition became a global front. By late 1990, nearly 40 nations stood united. On the sands of Saudi Arabia, soldiers from different languages and cultures trained side by side. Tanks bore flags from across the globe, jets roared overhead in mixed formations. For Saddam, this was a grave miscalculation. He had believed the Arab world would rally behind him against Western imperialism. Instead, they condemned him, leaving Iraq increasingly isolated. Yet Saddam refused to back down. His propaganda machine painted the coalition as crusaders, hoping to stir Islamic outrage. But the coalition's unity only grew stronger. This was no longer just a Gulf conflict, it was becoming a test of world order itself. As the coalition grew, pressure mounted on Saddam Hussein. Sanctions crippled Iraq's economy, diplomats demanded withdrawal, and the world braced for confrontation. Yet, Saddam did not waver. Instead, he doubled down. On Baghdad television, Saddam appeared in military fatigues, speaking with fiery defiance. He declared that Iraq would never surrender to imperialists and Zionists. His speeches framed the conflict not as aggression, but as resistance, an Arab nation standing tall against foreign domination. To the Iraqi people, he promised victory and glory. To the coalition, he issued threats. Most shocking was his decision to use hostages as human shields. Western nationals trapped in Iraq and Kuwait were rounded up and placed near military targets. Saddam even paraded some before cameras, smiling as frightened men and women sat beside him. It was a calculated move, meant to deter coalition strikes and shock the world. Instead, it hardened international resolve. Inside Iraq, fear and repression deepened. Dissenters were silenced, suspected traitors executed. Yet in the streets, murals and banners glorified Saddam as a modern Saladin, the warrior who would drive out invaders. His cult of personality grew even as hardship spread. Saddam believed he could fracture the coalition by manipulating Arab opinion. He invoked Palestine, linking Iraq's struggle with the Palestinian cause, hoping to split Arab states from Western allies. While his words resonated with some, most Arab governments stood firm. To the outside world, Saddam seemed reckless, but in his own mind, he was playing a high-stakes gamble. If he could hold Kuwait long enough, if he could withstand sanctions, and if coalition forces faltered, he might force a compromise that left him victorious. What he did not yet understand was that the world was preparing for war on a scale Iraq had never faced before. By late 1990, Operation Desert Shield had achieved its first goal. Iraq had been contained. Saudi Arabia was secure, but Kuwait remained under occupation, and Saddam showed no signs of leaving. Patience was running thin. In November, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 678, giving Iraq an ultimatum: withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, or face force. The clock was ticking. Behind the scenes, coalition forces were no longer just defending, they were preparing to strike. Bases in Saudi Arabia transformed into cities of steel. American Abrams tanks lined the desert, British Tornado jets streaked across the skies, and French Foreign Legion troops trained for desert warfare. The largest deployment of U.S. forces since World War II was now complete. Commanding it all was General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, a towering figure with a booming voice. Known as Stormin' Norman, he drilled his troops relentlessly, insisting they would be ready for anything. His counterpart in the air was General Chuck Horner, who coordinated an air armada unlike any in history. The coalition's strategy was clear: use overwhelming air power to shatter Iraq's defenses, then launch a swift ground campaign to liberate Kuwait. It was a plan that required precision, patience, and total unity. Meanwhile, Saddam dismissed the ultimatum. His propaganda boasted that Iraq would make the desert run red with the blood of invaders. His troops dug into trenches, laid mines, and fortified bunkers across Kuwait. The mother of all battles, as he called it, was coming. As the new year dawned, the world held its breath. The deadline was approaching. Diplomacy was failing, and in the deserts of Arabia, the coalition's might was ready to be unleashed. On the night of January 17, 1991, the skies over Baghdad erupted in fire. At exactly 2:38 a.m., coalition aircraft roared into Iraqi airspace, launching the most intense aerial campaign since World War II. The Gulf War had entered a new phase. Operation Desert Storm had begun. Coalition jets, American F-117 stealth fighters, British Tornadoes, French Jaguars, Saudi F-15s, swept in under the cover of darkness. Their targets: radar stations, missile launchers, command bunkers, and power plants. Explosions lit the night as precision-guided bombs struck with eerie accuracy. For the first time in history, the world watched a war unfold live on television. CNN's cameras broadcast Baghdad's skyline glowing orange, anti-aircraft fire tracing futile arcs into the night. Saddam's forces were overwhelmed. The vaunted Iraqi air defense, once thought formidable, collapsed within hours. Radar sites were blinded, communication lines severed. By dawn, coalition aircraft ruled the skies. For civilians in Baghdad, the air raids were terrifying. Sirens wailed as families huddled in basements, praying for safety. Yet for coalition leaders, the first hours were a triumph. The strategy was working. Air power would shatter Iraq before ground forces advanced. From that moment, the war belonged to the air. The Gulf War showcased a revolution in warfare. For the first time, smart bombs and stealth aircraft dominated the battlefield. The star of the campaign was the F-117 Nighthawk, the stealth fighter invisible to radar. Night after night, it slipped into Iraqi airspace, destroying command bunkers with laser-guided bombs. Cameras mounted on bombs broadcast their targets: bridges, factories, runways, struck with pinpoint precision. The world was stunned. This was not the blind carpet bombing of past wars. This was surgical. Coalition planners called it shock and awe. Iraq's infrastructure was systematically dismantled, power grids knocked out, communication hubs flattened, weapons factories reduced to rubble. Iraqi soldiers, already weary, watched helplessly as their defenses crumbled from the sky. To the public, these smart bombs became symbols of American technological superiority. On television, glowing green video feeds showed bombs guiding themselves into tiny windows or onto exact vehicles. It was war as spectacle, and it captivated millions. Yet the reality on the ground was harsher. Not every bomb hit its target. Civilians in Baghdad, Basra, and other cities paid the price when strikes went astray. Even precision had limits, and war remained brutal. Still, the message was clear. The coalition's technology had given it a decisive edge. Saddam's army might be large, but it was being dismantled piece by piece from the sky. As coalition airstrikes intensified, Saddam Hussein sought a way to retaliate. His weapon of choice, Scud missiles. From hidden launchers in the desert, Iraqi crews fired dozens of Scuds toward Saudi Arabia and Israel. The missiles screamed through the night sky, crude but deadly. Cities trembled as sirens wailed and explosions tore through neighborhoods. For Israel, the threat was dire. Baghdad's goal was to provoke Israeli retaliation, hoping to fracture the Arab coalition partners. In Tel Aviv and Haifa, civilians rushed into gas mask shelters, fearing not just missiles but possible chemical warheads. American diplomats pleaded with Israel, "Do not respond." Restraint was critical to keep Arab states in the coalition. Remarkably, Israel agreed, choosing patience over revenge. Meanwhile, the coalition unveiled another technological marvel: the Patriot missile system. Deployed in Saudi Arabia and Israel, these interceptors shot down incoming Scuds. Often live on television. The dramatic images of missiles colliding mid-air became iconic symbols of defense. Though the Scuds caused terror and casualties, they did not change the course of the war. Instead, they underscored Saddam's desperation and the coalition's determination to hold firm. By February 1991, the air war had devastated Iraq's military. Airfields were silent, tanks burned in the desert, and supply lines lay in ruins. Yet Saddam's army remained dug in across Kuwait, protected by trenches, minefields, and bunkers. To finish the job, the coalition would need to move on the ground. The buildup was immense. Over 500,000 coalition troops, supported by thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, stood ready at the Saudi border. General Schwarzkopf and his commanders finalized their bold plan: a massive left-hook maneuver that would sweep through the desert, encircle the Iraqi army, and liberate Kuwait in a matter of days. Coalition soldiers trained relentlessly. American Marines rehearsed beach landings, deceiving Iraq into expecting an amphibious assault. British forces prepared for armored breakthroughs. Arab allies, Saudi, Egyptian, and Syrian troops, were assigned to liberate parts of Kuwait itself, ensuring Arab participation was visible. Inside Kuwait, Iraqi soldiers waited in fear and exhaustion. Weeks of bombing had broken their spirit. Trenches were filled with mud and oil. Many conscripts dreamed of surrender rather than fighting. Yet Saddam's loyal officers stood behind them with threats of execution for retreat. As February 23 approached, the world knew the ground war was inevitable. Diplomacy had failed. The air campaign had weakened the enemy. Now the desert was about to explode with the largest armored offensive since World War II. On February 24, 1991, after weeks of relentless airstrikes, coalition forces launched the long-awaited ground offensive. The desert erupted in motion as hundreds of thousands of troops surged forward, tanks roaring across sand dunes and artillery pounding Iraqi positions. This was the beginning of the end for Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. General Norman Schwarzkopf coordinated a massive maneuver, a left-hook strategy, designed to flank Iraqi forces entrenched in Kuwait, while avoiding a head-on assault. American armored divisions spearheaded the attack, supported by British Challenger tanks, French forces, and Arab units from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. Iraqi troops, many conscripts with minimal training, were caught off guard. The weeks of bombing had shattered morale. Anti-tank missiles and artillery fire tore through defensive lines, while coalition aircraft continued to dominate the skies, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. By the end of the first day, coalition forces had penetrated deep into Kuwaiti territory. Desert dust rose in clouds as tanks and vehicles carved paths through previously impenetrable lines. For the soldiers on the ground, the desert was both battlefield and obstacle, its scorching sun and endless sand adding to the physical and psychological strain. The speed and coordination of the assault left Iraqi forces reeling. Command posts were destroyed, communications severed, and panic spread. Some units surrendered almost immediately, while others dug in desperately, hoping to hold the line. By nightfall, the coalition had established a secure front, ready to continue the rapid advance that would soon liberate Kuwait entirely. As coalition forces advanced rapidly through southern Kuwait, they approached Kuwait City, the heart of the occupied nation. Iraqi forces had fortified streets with trenches, sandbags, and anti-tank obstacles, but the combination of coalition air dominance and armored speed made defense almost impossible. On February 26, 1991, the first units entered the city. Residents, long under occupation, watched in disbelief as tanks bearing coalition flags rolled past. Streets that had been quiet under fear now echoed with cheering and tears. For many Kuwaitis, liberation had arrived in a blur of armored vehicles and allied soldiers. Iraqi forces resisted in pockets, setting fire to oil wells and government buildings to slow the coalition's advance. Smoke rose in thick black columns as artillery shells and small arms fire erupted across the city. Yet the coalition pressed forward, systematically clearing each neighborhood. The psychological impact on Iraqi troops was devastating. Units that had barely survived the air campaign now faced unstoppable forces in close combat. Surrender became common. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers laid down their weapons, waving white flags amid the chaos of retreat. For coalition troops, the liberation was bittersweet. Victory was evident, yet the city bore the scars of occupation and sabotage. Oil fields burned, homes destroyed, and civilians traumatized. Soldiers worked alongside Kuwaiti citizens to provide aid and restore order, a testament to the coalition's dual mission of liberation and protection. By the end of the day, Kuwait City was fully liberated, signaling the collapse of Iraq's occupation and marking a pivotal turning point in the Gulf War. As Iraqi forces retreated north from Kuwait City toward Basra, they left behind a trail of destruction that would become infamous as the Highway of Death. Coalition air power relentlessly targeted convoys of tanks, trucks, and troop transports as they fled. The desert road became a graveyard, littered with burning vehicles, scattered equipment, and the remnants of a defeated army. Pilots reported a terrifying scene from above, long lines of vehicles engulfed in flames, smoke rising high into the sky. Soldiers and conscripts tried to escape, many jumping from their trucks or running across the desert, only to be caught in bombardments. For the coalition, it was a stark example of the war's overwhelming firepower. For Iraqis, it was a symbol of total defeat. Civilians in nearby areas watched in horror, witnessing both the destruction and the desperation of men fleeing for survival. The Highway of Death was not just a military route, it became a haunting image of modern mechanized warfare, broadcast worldwide, shocking the global public. Despite the devastation, coalition forces continued their advance. Morale among Allied troops surged, while Iraqi resistance crumbled. The ground war had proven decisive. Saddam Hussein's army was broken, and the liberation of Kuwait was complete. Yet the images from the highway would linger in collective memory, a reminder of both technological supremacy and the human cost of conflict. By late February 1991, Iraqi forces had been decisively defeated. Retreating from Kuwait and southern Iraq, the remnants of Saddam Hussein's army left behind a trail of destruction, burned-out tanks, abandoned equipment, and shattered morale. The coalition's rapid advance had left little room for organized defense. Saddam remained in Baghdad, refusing to surrender. His regime survived, but the psychological blow to Iraq was immense. Families mourned lost sons, conscripts returned home, traumatized, and entire military units had disbanded under the pressure of superior coalition forces. In Kuwait, the liberation was a scene of jubilation and mourning simultaneously. Citizens returned to damaged homes, streets littered with debris, and scorched oil fields. Coalition engineers and local workers began clearing roads, restoring electricity, and helping civilians recover. The victory was swift, but the scars of occupation were deep. Globally, the war left an unmistakable mark. For the United States and its allies, Desert Storm was a demonstration of technological might, coordination, and overwhelming strategy. For Iraq, it was a humbling defeat that revealed the limitations of Saddam Hussein's ambitions and the consequences of defying international law. Yet the conflict also highlighted unresolved tensions in the Middle East. Kuwait was liberated, but Saddam remained in power, a constant threat for future crises. The United Nations would maintain sanctions for years, and coalition forces stayed in the region to deter further aggression. The Gulf War's aftermath was a lesson in power, diplomacy, and the costs of modern warfare, a story of liberation, devastation, and the fragile balance of peace in a volatile region. By late February 1991, Kuwait was fully liberated, and the coalition declared victory. The Gulf War, though brief, had reshaped modern warfare and international relations. Precision airstrikes, stealth technology, and rapid armored advances had demonstrated the overwhelming capabilities of a united coalition. Across the world, people watched in awe and relief. News coverage showed burning oil fields being extinguished, destroyed Iraqi tanks, and smiling Kuwaiti citizens waving flags. Leaders praised the coalition's unity and planning, while analysts debated the long-term consequences for the Middle East. For Saddam Hussein, the war was a personal defeat. He remained in power, but his army was broken, his credibility shattered, and Iraq faced crippling sanctions. The war had proven that defiance against the international community came at a high price. The Gulf War also left a profound legacy for military strategy. Coalition forces had demonstrated the effectiveness of precision-guided munitions, integrated command systems, and multinational cooperation. The shock and awe campaign would become a model for future conflicts. For Kuwait, it was a moment of rebirth. Citizens returned home, rebuilt communities, and celebrated their freedom. Yet the scars of occupation, the oil fires, destroyed infrastructure, and human losses served as a reminder of how quickly peace could be shattered. The world emerged with a new understanding. The Middle East remained volatile, global powers could project force rapidly, and the balance between diplomacy and military action had changed forever. Even after the liberation of Kuwait, the Gulf region remained in turmoil. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled Iraq and Kuwait, seeking safety in neighboring countries. Desert roads overflowed with families carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Tents sprang up along borders, creating sprawling refugee camps where the displaced waited for aid. The environmental damage was immense. As Iraqi forces retreated, they set fire to Kuwaiti oil wells, creating thick black smoke that choked the sky. Rivers of burning oil flowed into the desert, destroying ecosystems and leaving scars that would take decades to heal. The smell of sulfur and smoke lingered for miles, a constant reminder of Saddam's scorched earth tactics. Meanwhile, political instability simmered. In Iraq, Shia and Kurdish populations began to express discontent with Saddam's regime, seeing his defeat as a sign of vulnerability. In the wider Arab world, nations debated the role of Western powers. While Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria had supported the coalition, some citizens questioned the presence of foreign troops on Arab soil. The Gulf War had demonstrated the interconnectedness of global politics. Local conflicts had worldwide consequences, from skyrocketing oil prices to international humanitarian aid efforts. The refugees, the environmental devastation, and the regional instability underscored that even a short war could reshape societies, economies, and geopolitics. The Gulf War was more than a regional conflict. It was a global event that reshaped military strategy, diplomacy, and international relations. Nations across the world analyzed the campaign's unprecedented use of precision-guided munitions, stealth technology, and integrated air-ground operations. Military academies studied Desert Storm as a model for modern warfare. Economically, the war sent oil markets into turbulence. Prices spiked as fears of regional instability gripped the world. Yet in the months following the war, the quick liberation of Kuwait restored confidence in international cooperation and the effectiveness of multilateral intervention. Politically, the war underscored the importance of coalition building. Nearly 40 countries had contributed forces, resources, or diplomatic support, demonstrating the power of collective action. The United Nations' role in sanctioning Iraq and legitimizing intervention became a model for future conflicts. For Iraq, the defeat had profound consequences. Sanctions, combined with the loss of military strength and international isolation, weakened Saddam's regime. Yet he remained in power, sowing the seeds for future tensions and conflicts in the Middle East. The Gulf War also reshaped public perception of warfare. For the first time, live media coverage brought real-time images of battles, casualties, and destruction into homes worldwide. Civilians saw the horrors of modern mechanized war, the precision of smart bombs, and the vulnerabilities of entrenched armies. Ultimately, the lessons of the Gulf War were clear. Technology and coordination could deliver swift victory, but the human, environmental, and political costs were immense. Nations learned that while military might could achieve objectives, sustainable peace required diplomacy, reconstruction, and long-term planning. The Gulf War's legacy endures, not just in the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq, but in the strategies, alliances, and cautionary tales it left for generations to come. Following the coalition's victory, the United Nations imposed strict sanctions on Iraq to prevent future aggression and compel Saddam Hussein to comply with disarmament requirements. These sanctions targeted military equipment, trade, and essential goods, creating severe shortages across the country. Iraq's infrastructure, already weakened by bombing, now faced crippling limitations. Hospitals struggled to treat the sick, schools lacked resources, and basic necessities like food and medicine became scarce. The sanctions were intended to pressure Saddam's regime, but ordinary Iraqis bore the brunt of the hardship. At the same time, coalition forces maintained a presence in the region to enforce no-fly zones and deter any resurgence of Iraqi aggression. American and British troops patrolled the skies and borders, ensuring that Saddam could not rebuild his military unchecked. Diplomats debated endlessly. The sanctions were effective in limiting military potential, but they also caused widespread human suffering. The Gulf War's end did not bring peace for Iraq. Instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged period of international scrutiny, isolation, and humanitarian crisis. The Gulf War's military success came at a heavy human cost. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers died, many conscripts with little training, forced to fight in impossible conditions. Civilians, especially in Kuwait and southern Iraq, faced destruction of homes, displacement, and trauma from air and ground assaults. The highway of death remained an enduring symbol of human suffering, showing how retreating forces were decimated. Families mourned sons, fathers, and brothers. Hospitals overflowed, and aid agencies struggled to provide assistance amid political and logistical challenges. In Kuwait, citizens celebrated liberation, yet the trauma of occupation was visible everywhere. Homes were damaged, families lost members, and the scars of war ran deep. Oil fires caused environmental damage, leaving blackened landscapes and health hazards that persisted for years. Soldiers from coalition forces also paid a price. Psychological strain, injuries, and the haunting images of destruction lingered long after the conflict ended. The Gulf War illustrated that modern mechanized warfare, while rapid and decisive, cannot avoid devastating human consequences. The Gulf War left a lasting legacy for military strategy, international diplomacy, and global awareness. Nations around the world observed how technology, coalition building, and precision warfare could achieve rapid and decisive victories. Smart bombs, stealth aircraft, and integrated operations became the benchmark for modern military campaigns. Politically, the war reinforced the importance of international coalitions and United Nations legitimacy. Nearly 40 countries participated in the effort, demonstrating that global cooperation could enforce international law and deter aggression. The success of the coalition became a model for future interventions, while also highlighting the limits of military power in achieving long-term peace. For civilians, the Gulf War emphasized the vulnerability of non-combatants in modern conflicts. Refugees, displaced families, and victims of infrastructure collapse showed that victory in war does not automatically translate to immediate human security. Aid, reconstruction, and diplomacy became essential components of post-conflict recovery. The environmental destruction, burning oil fields, scorched deserts, and pollution served as a stark reminder that wars leave long-lasting scars on nature, communities, and economies. Ultimately, the Gulf War taught the world a critical lesson: technological superiority and overwhelming force can win battles, but sustainable peace requires foresight, planning, and compassion for those caught in the crossfire. The conflict reshaped military doctrine, diplomatic strategies, and humanitarian awareness, leaving lessons that remain relevant decades later. After the Gulf War ended, the coalition established no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq to prevent Saddam Hussein from attacking Kurdish and Shia populations. American, British, and French aircraft patrolled the skies daily, enforcing a delicate balance between deterrence and provocation. For Iraqis, life under continued surveillance was a mix of fear and resentment. Kurdish communities in the north enjoyed some protection, yet tensions remained high as sporadic clashes with Iraqi forces occurred. In the south, Shia populations cautiously celebrated newfound freedoms, but any sign of uprising was met with swift, often brutal retaliation by Saddam's regime. The no-fly zones became a symbol of the ongoing struggle between international oversight and national sovereignty. Coalition forces, though victorious in the Gulf War, had to maintain vigilance to prevent Saddam from regaining power. The region's political landscape remained fragile, highlighting that military victory did not automatically bring stability. International diplomacy continued, with UN inspectors overseeing Iraq's compliance with weapons inspections. Yet the legacy of war and the fear of future aggression kept coalition forces involved for years, demonstrating that the Gulf War's end was only the beginning of a prolonged period of oversight and tension. The Gulf War left lasting environmental devastation across Kuwait and southern Iraq. As Iraqi forces retreated, hundreds of oil wells were set ablaze, creating massive black plumes that darkened the skies and caused widespread air pollution. Rivers of crude oil contaminated soil and water, decimating local ecosystems. The smoke and soot affected neighboring countries, causing health problems such as respiratory illness and long-term exposure risks. Kuwaiti wildlife, from desert foxes to migratory birds, suffered from habitat destruction, while agricultural lands were rendered infertile. Coalition forces and international agencies worked to contain the damage. Firefighting teams battled the burning oil fields for months, while environmental scientists assessed the long-term ecological consequences. The conflict illustrated that modern wars could leave invisible scars on the planet, affecting health, livelihoods, and biodiversity for years after the fighting ended. The Gulf War became a cautionary tale. Even quick and decisive victories could not prevent collateral damage to the environment. Nations learned that in addition to human and political consequences, environmental stewardship must be a component of post-conflict recovery planning. The Gulf War's impact on psychology and society was profound. Soldiers returning home faced post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, grappling with memories of intense combat, destruction, and the highway of death. Nightmares, anxiety, and survivor guilt became common among veterans. In Iraq, citizens lived under the shadow of sanctions, destroyed infrastructure, and ongoing repression. Families struggled to rebuild, cope with loss, and navigate a society tightly controlled by Saddam's regime. The scars of fear, grief, and trauma were evident in every community. Kuwait's society, though liberated, also faced long-term challenges. Rebuilding cities, clearing mines, extinguishing oil fires, and restoring essential services tested the nation's resilience. Families mourned lost loved ones and struggled to restore normalcy amid lingering rubble. The war reshaped public consciousness globally. Television and media coverage brought real-time images of war into homes worldwide, changing perceptions of conflict. Civilians and policymakers alike became acutely aware that modern warfare, though technologically advanced, carried immense human, psychological, and societal costs. The lessons of Desert Storm emphasized that true victory is not just military success, it is the restoration of communities, the healing of minds, and the rebuilding of society. The Gulf War left the world with a clear reminder: while wars can be won, the human spirit and social fabric must be carefully tended long after the last shot is fired. The Gulf War reshaped global geopolitics. For the first time since World War II, a coalition of nations united under the United Nations flag to enforce international law, demonstrating that collective action could check regional aggression. Countries around the world analyzed the war's outcomes, how diplomacy, economic sanctions, and overwhelming military power could achieve objectives without full-scale occupation. The United States emerged as the dominant superpower, showcasing the effectiveness of modern technology, strategic planning, and international partnerships. At the same time, the conflict highlighted the fragility of alliances. Arab nations supported the coalition, yet public opinion in some countries was divided over Western military presence. Saddam Hussein remained in power, signaling that military defeat did not always equate to political change. The lessons were clear: rapid military campaigns could achieve tactical victories, but long-term peace required diplomacy, reconstruction, and careful monitoring. The Gulf War set a precedent for future conflicts, from Iraq's no-fly zones to multinational interventions in other regions. Leaders worldwide studied Desert Storm as a model for integrating technology, intelligence, and international cooperation. The Gulf War's legacy extends far beyond military achievements. It changed how the world approaches warfare, media, and international cooperation. The introduction of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and integrated command systems became standard in modern militaries. For civilians in the Middle East, the conflict left lasting scars. Refugees, destroyed cities, and environmental damage reminded the world that war's consequences extend beyond the battlefield. Kuwait was rebuilt, yet Iraq faced years of sanctions and isolation. The psychological toll on soldiers and civilians alike lingered, shaping generations. Politically, Desert Storm reinforced the value of coalition building and multilateral diplomacy. Nations learned that force alone cannot solve conflicts. Strategic planning, global support, and long-term oversight are essential. The Gulf War also served as a warning to authoritarian regimes. Modern military power, combined with international pressure, can quickly dismantle aggressive ambitions. Media coverage transformed public perception. For the first time, real-time reporting brought vivid images of conflict into homes worldwide. People witnessed both technological marvels and human tragedy, understanding that even swift, decisive victories come at a profound human cost. Ultimately, the Gulf War remains a defining moment in modern history, a story of liberation, innovation, human endurance, and cautionary lessons. Its legacy is a reminder that while wars can be won with strategy and technology, true peace requires foresight, diplomacy, and empathy for those caught in the crossfire. The Gulf War left an indelible mark on popular culture and collective memory. For many around the world, Desert Storm was the first war they witnessed live on television, with rolling footage of bombings, stealth aircraft, and liberation efforts. News networks became storytellers of modern warfare, and the public consumed war as both reality and spectacle. Movies, documentaries, and books quickly emerged, depicting the conflict from multiple perspectives: soldiers' bravery, civilian suffering, and the geopolitical chessboard. In Kuwait, national identity was strengthened. Citizens celebrated liberation anniversaries, erected memorials, and shared personal stories of resilience. In Iraq, the war was remembered with fear, loss, and defiance. Families recounted surviving air raids, witnessing retreating convoys, and enduring sanctions. Cultural expression, literature, art, and oral history captured the psychological scars, the heroism, and the sorrow of a nation under duress. Globally, Desert Storm shaped how societies perceive war, a blend of technological awe, ethical dilemmas, and human cost. The conflict became a touchstone for understanding the balance between military efficiency and humanitarian responsibility. The Gulf War transformed the relationship between media and warfare. For the first time, live television broadcasts brought frontline action into living rooms worldwide. CNN and other networks became central to shaping public perception, providing continuous updates on bombings, troop movements, and civilian impact. This unprecedented media coverage had profound effects. Governments were conscious of how actions were portrayed. Military decisions were scrutinized under public eye. Civilians gained near real-time understanding of strategic developments, yet also experienced the emotional toll of seeing destruction unfold live. For soldiers, the war's portrayal was double-edged. Pride in mission success contrasted with frustration at the oversimplification of their experiences for dramatic effect. Analysts and historians later debated how the Gulf War media model changed future conflicts, from Kosovo to Iraq in 2003, emphasizing the importance of narrative management alongside battlefield operations. Desert Storm proved that media could be as decisive as missiles, influencing morale, diplomacy, and historical memory. Public perception became a key battlefield, shaping both domestic and international policy for years to come. The Gulf War revolutionized military doctrine worldwide. The success of precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and integrated air-ground operations became a blueprint for modern warfare. Military academies across the globe studied Desert Storm as a case study in efficiency, technological superiority, and coalition coordination. Commanders learned the importance of speed, intelligence, and joint operations, where air, land, and naval forces worked seamlessly. The left hook maneuver in the desert became a classic example of strategic flanking and rapid penetration of enemy defenses. At the same time, the Gulf War emphasized the need for humanitarian considerations. Civilian casualties, environmental damage, and psychological trauma highlighted that modern warfare requires planning beyond just battlefield objectives. Military training began integrating civil affairs, disaster response, and post-conflict stabilization as critical components of operational planning. Desert Storm also accelerated innovation in surveillance, communication, and logistics. Drones, satellite imaging, and networked command systems were refined, ensuring that future conflicts could leverage technology for rapid, decisive outcomes. The Gulf War left the world with a clear lesson: success in modern conflict depends on the synergy of technology, strategy, and humanity, and victories are measured not only by military achievements, but by the ability to stabilize regions afterward. The Gulf War showcased leadership under pressure, from General Norman Schwarzkopf commanding coalition forces to President George H.W. Bush guiding international diplomacy. Their decisions, swift, calculated, and coordinated, demonstrated the importance of strategy, communication, and adaptability in modern conflict. Schwarzkopf's meticulous planning, combined with the coalition's technological edge, allowed for rapid victory while minimizing coalition casualties. Bush's diplomatic efforts ensured that nearly 40 nations joined the coalition, showing that leadership extended beyond the battlefield. Yet leadership was also tested in unexpected ways. Commanders had to balance military objectives with humanitarian concerns, maintain morale among diverse forces, and navigate public scrutiny amplified by live media coverage. For Saddam Hussein, leadership failure was evident in miscalculations, rigid strategies, and an inability to maintain troop cohesion, resulting in swift defeat. The Gulf War underscored that leadership is not just about authority, it is about foresight, collaboration, and responsibility, lessons that extend far beyond military applications. Leaders' decisions affected millions of lives, and their legacies continue to influence how wars are planned and fought today. The Gulf War left enduring lessons for the world. Precision warfare, coalition building, and technological integration became benchmarks for future conflicts. Governments recognized the importance of combining diplomacy, economic measures, and military action to achieve sustainable results. The human cost reminded policymakers that war is never without consequences. Civilians suffered, environments were damaged, and soldiers returned with trauma. Modern warfare required careful planning beyond immediate objectives, including reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and post-conflict stabilization. International law and multilateral cooperation were reinforced. The UN's role in sanctioning Iraq and legitimizing intervention demonstrated that collective action could check aggression and maintain a semblance of order in a volatile world. For military professionals, Desert Storm became a case study in joint operations, demonstrating how air, land, and naval forces can operate synergistically. For the global public, the war highlighted the need for awareness, ethical consideration, and engagement in international affairs. Ultimately, the Gulf War's lessons were clear. Victory is measured not only by the battlefield but also by peace, recovery, and the prevention of future conflict. The world learned that foresight, unity, and responsibility are as critical as firepower. The Gulf War remains a defining moment in modern history, a story of strategy, courage, and the human spirit. From the deserts of Kuwait to the halls of international diplomacy, the conflict demonstrated the power of unity, technology, and leadership. Civilians, soldiers, and nations were all transformed. Kuwait was liberated, but the scars of war remained. Iraq faced sanctions and reconstruction, while the coalition learned that swift victories must be accompanied by long-term planning and humanitarian awareness. Globally, Desert Storm reshaped perceptions of warfare. Real-time media coverage connected distant audiences to the realities of conflict. The war became a reference point for military professionals, historians, and policymakers alike, shaping doctrine, strategy, and international relations for decades. Yet beyond tactics and technology, the Gulf War's ultimate legacy lies in resilience, reflection, and responsibility. It reminds us that while battles can be won, lasting peace depends on rebuilding communities, healing wounds, and learning from the past. As the desert sands settle and smoke clears, the Gulf War stands as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human perseverance. Its lessons endure, urging future generations to seek unity over division, foresight over impulsivity, and empathy over indifference.